The question I want to address today in this video is, what is the self? When we are talking about the self in the spiritual context, what do we mean? And if we contemplate that for ourselves, what should we look out for? What are its characteristics? How can we see the self unfolding in our experience? The self has two different meanings, basically. There is the egoic self, the small self, which is our habitual response to whatever we experience. It is that through which we look at the world. It is our lens of perception. It drives our everyday action when we have not yet developed our insight and our capacity to connect with the larger self on the other hand. The big self, the self with the capital S, that is the whole manifestation moving this experience, this world forward. It is the underlying principle that manifests reality, not only in the forms that we perceive, but also in its capacity to be consciously aware of itself. So the big self is the whole pattern moving, which from that point of view, there is no self. The first self, once it's recognized to be just a pattern of habitual response and experience and response to experience, it dissolves, and when we dissolve into that capital S self, we recognize actually the word self doesn't apply. This capital S self has no one in it. It is just the experience unfolding with no possibility of being a self, because there is no other to compare it to. It's just the one consciousness experiencing itself, you could say. So starting out with our contemplation in spiritual practice, we are coming at everything that we experience, also the spiritual practices, we come at them with a small s self, with our egoic tendencies, with our thinking mind, with our conceptualizations that we have learned through our phases in life, from early childhood to when we were grown up. We learned habitual responses. We learned how to interpret what we experience. And that is really the key aspect that we have to look out for when we contemplate, is the question, are my interpretations of what I experience actually true? Or am I, through my interpretations, creating a story that is not represented in reality? But through that creation of the story, another level of reality is created. And maybe, if that is not true, maybe that level of reality that is created through my own stories, maybe that is causing me problems. And now, in spiritual practice and contemplation, I want to see if that is the case. That is the approach you're taking with your spiritual inquiry. And the patterns we are looking for are almost imperceptible. We cannot really see them without some contemplative effort, without some meditative insight. Because they are so quick that it seems that when we experience something, that second level of reality that is created through the stories and interpretation, it seems to be there. It really seems to be in the experience. And therefore, when you ask someone who is not practicing these spiritual meditative techniques, he will say, yes, obviously there is me, myself, as this human being, in contrast and separated from the world, because it really seems that way, with a lack of subtlety, with a lack of subtle insight, with the ability to discern these two levels of reality. The interpretation that isn't happening in words in your mind, by the way. It's not like, oh, I'm perceiving the object, now let's create the separation object-subject and make this a process of perception. No, this is immediate. It is not happening on the level of the intellect. Then it would be easy to see, but it isn't. And when we perceive an object, in that very instance, we project that object outside of consciousness. We say the world of objects that we perceive is somehow not me, meaning it is based, usually we think of it as matter of a physical universe outside of consciousness. And then we withdraw our consciousness and say, the consciousness aspect of this experience is somehow here, over here. I'm identified with it. And objects do not have that conscious quality. They are not themselves inside consciousness. And then on top of that, the process is that we separate ourselves seemingly from the experience of the world and put ourselves somehow opposed to it, even though with further inquiry and a clear look at how things are, you will recognize that there is actually no separate you. That the object you perceive is actually fully self-conscious. It's all there is. It doesn't need any agent that perceives it. It doesn't need any separate entity for it to exist in the way you usually think of what you experience. You think, these objects need me for their existence. I perceive them and therefore they come into existence, into consciousness, into my experience. But that is not the case. If you closely observe an object in your contemplation and you do that for long enough, you can separate out what the state of experience is like without any false interpretation of that experience. And so the self really gets created through the small s self, gets created through the process of spinning a story around your immediate experience, which doesn't make it less real than anything else you experience. Don't fall into that trap thinking, oh, now because it is created through that mechanism, it is somehow less real than anything else. No, it is just the mechanism by which it gets created. You could also say it has the same validity as any other physical object that gets created through physical processes, like sunlight getting created through the nuclear fission in the sun. It is just the process how the small self s gets created in your experience. But it can cause you problems, and that's why in spiritual practice we are looking for ways to align our interpretation more closely with reality, with what is actually the case. And therefore, this contemplation will dissolve the sense that this small s self has actually some inherent existence outside of a concept. That is the crucial insight. It isn't about destroying and completely getting rid of the small s self. That wouldn't be beneficial. It is just in seeing how it is created, in seeing through its illusory story, that it loses its power, and whatever is false in that story will have no more grip over you, over your actions, over your emotions. That is all that is necessary. So the small s self is your habitual response of creating the story on top of what you experience of there is somehow this separated self. And it is a very strong story because it is so closely related, and it hijacks this feeling of I exist, I am. And it incorporates this strong feeling of I exist into its story. It says, yeah, of course, the small s self, is responsible for that feeling of I am. But that is not the case. If you look closely, this I am, this sense of being somehow the one who experiences, that part of your experience is not limited at all to the story you tell yourself about yourself. It is not at all limited to something here connected over here to the body and is withholding that sense of beingness from the world. No, the sense of I am is equally present in every part of your experience. It is equally present in every little dot of whatever you perceive. It is just that this story of I am this human body, this human with this certain kind of life experience and memories, that is the sense of I am. No, that is a contracted form of that feeling, of that underlying, ever-present context of your experience. But actually, the closer you look and the more clearly you see your experience, you will notice that that is actually equally present everywhere. And you could also, from that point of view, you see clearly how you could also spin a story and put your sense of self onto any other thing. Because then it is just seen as a story. I could equally attribute the sense of self to any other object that is not the body. Only this body, as we grew up, was the most important thing to us, to survive, to care, to get what we needed from our parents. It was the best story we could create in order to secure our survival, to say, I have to care only about my body to survive. I have to get my parents to give me what I need to survive. And the environment to be the way that is conducive to this body, because that is what we only cared about for a certain period of our life. But then when you are grown up, there comes a time where you can transcend this, where you no longer need that story of, okay, I have to secure everything for this body, and therefore I also contract my sense of self only to this object in my experience. to this body. It is a story that is not true and that can cause problems. And once you see that, you are free to explore and expand your sense of self through that spiritual self-inquiry, through those various methods you can use. And once you do that, your ability to see clearly is going to expand. And this sense of being able in every moment, if you want to distinguish your story about what you experience and how it connects to the small S self from that which is actually going on, to distinguish those two, that is a very powerful ability. It is so powerful in social context because you can clearly see the difference between the stories that everyone creates around the common experience and the actual reality. Which doesn't mean that you always have the correct interpretation. No, not at all. But it helps to take emotions aside, to see them for what they are, to also see the different interpretations based on like this egoic lens that most people bring to the experience. And then it feels like you are kind of a wizard in those situations, because you can so clearly see the situation that it is almost magical to other people, what you are capable of seeing, where your mind can go and see the root of a problem where most other people are not even able to comprehend. And that takes time and practice, and that will develop over time also as a side effect of your spiritual practice. And you shouldn't focus on that, but it's just a nice benefit for yourself and others that you're interacting with. Your ability to see clearly, that is a very powerful ability. And once you are seeing clearly what the small self is, what we were talking about so far, the possibility of seeing the capital S self, or the whole of reality manifesting itself, God, if you want to call it that, being able to see that becomes a possibility once you have seen through the structures of the small S self, and they start to fall away temporarily, or some of them even continuously. And then you see, maybe in a flash of insight or over time, bit by bit, you can see how reality actually moves, how spontaneous it is, how it manifests, and how it manifests everything equally, including the sense of being a human, of being a small S self. You transcend even that level, and you see how all of that gets manifested. And it will usually start in deep meditation sessions, where you can access the ground of reality, where you can access that which is present in every experience, but also makes possible every experience. It's the pure consciousness that at some point is also clearly seen to be no thing at all. Pure consciousness in that sense is just another conceptual idea, but it is not inherently existent. as nothing really is, but it is not as easy to point out as a physical object. It doesn't exist as something separate in your experience, and therefore it is more accurate to say the ground of reality is unmanifest. It is no thing. And it simultaneously is what is able to hold your experience, to make it possible, to make it conscious. And that whole process, the more you align with that, and by the way, it feels very beautiful to experience reality on the level of pure consciousness, because it becomes, even though you're able to see and perceive things, it becomes equally alive, equally homogeneously beautiful. It has your experience has a kind of very precious or very divine quality to it. It's like everything you see with your eyes, you touch immediately. It's like very intimate. It becomes alive. That's what it feels like for me. It is, everything is equally alive. Because you see past the different qualities of the forms. You see past the distinguishing aspect of reality into that level of reality where everyone and everything is the same, where every experience you're having is an expression of that same inner nature, of that same inner capital S self. And that is, perceiving reality on that level is just divine. That is really the word that is most, or blissful, is most accurate, describes the experience most accurately. Divine peacefulness is what the quality of the experience is like once you see everything that manifests as an expression of your true self. And that is the fruit of the path. That is what you get out of it once you surrender yourself, once you surrender that which keeps you from looking at reality in that way. So I hope this video made it clear what the path is like from the viewpoint of the self, of starting out from this very limited sense of identity and then looking at that, how that is created, how that creates the division and separation between the experience you're having and the story you are creating, that there is a separate self from that, to this capital S self, which is really no self because it has no defining, separating quality to it, and moving through those different kinds of identifications along the spiritual path. I hope this made it clear that what it means when people are talking about the egoic self and the capital S self, or the no self, or God mind, then this is really what the path is like for the self. So maybe from your current state of identification, it is a dissolution of the self that may also come with a crisis, with feelings of feeling lost and deep inner doubt, maybe even fear and anxiety. But then it is also replaced with this much deeper knowing, with this much deeper connection to reality that is much more in line with reality, with truth, and therefore feels much more harmonious, and the process can be very beautiful. And the fruit of the path as I mentioned, is this peaceful, blissful state of recognition, of interacting, of being in the world, that is just very worthwhile to strive for, in my experience, and with the many people that I've talked to and worked with over the years. So this is what I wanted to share today. Hope it was helpful. Please give the video a thumbs up. Share it if you enjoyed it. It helps the channel. And yeah, check out my website, my blog, if you're interested in reading more about this spiritual stuff. And thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Goodbye.